There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It settles into your bones, slowly, over years, and it comes from carrying weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. I know that exhaustion well, because I lived inside it for a long time without ever giving it a name. The name, when I finally found it, was simple. It was my brother. And the moment everything changed was not loud, not dramatic, and nothing like what he expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a county records office, and my signature on a document that would quietly rearrange the rest of his life. My name is Serena Voss, and I have been waiting a long time to tell this story the way it actually happened. My brother Marcus and I did not grow up with much, but we grew up together, and for a long time I believed that counted for something permanent. We were raised in a small inland town called Millbrook in central Tennessee, the kind of place that looks the same in every direction and smells like cut grass in summer and wood smoke from October onward. Our parents, Dwight and Lorraine Voss, were quiet, hard-working people who had both grown up without the security they wanted and spent their adult lives making sure their children felt the opposite. Our father drove a delivery route 6 days a week. Our mother kept the books for 2 small businesses in town and cleaned a law office on Friday evenings to make the number work at the end of each month. We were not poor, exactly, but we understood the edges of things. Marcus was 4 years older than me, and growing up he was the axis that everything else in our house rotated around, not because he demanded it, but because he was the kind of person who filled space without trying. Loud in the way that draws people rather than repels them, quick to laugh, generous when it cost him nothing. He was the one our parents talked about at the dinner table when they wanted to feel proud of something, and I loved him with the uncomplicated fierceness that younger siblings often carry before they understand enough to question it. When I was 12 and Marcus was 16, our mother was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that required ongoing treatment and, more significantly, required her to reduce her hours. The family income tightened in ways that were not discussed openly, but were felt by everyone. Our father added an evening route on top of his regular one. I started helping our mother with the bookkeeping she brought home, learning the work beside her at the kitchen table on weekday evenings, because it was something I could do and she needed the help. Marcus, who was already popular and already restless, spent more of his time outside the house during those years. I did not hold it against him. He was a teenager and I was a child, and I did not yet have the vocabulary for what I was observing. He left for a trade apprenticeship in Nashville 2 months after graduating high school, and within a year, he had pivoted from trades into sales, and within 3 years, he had pivoted again into real estate development, following a friend into a growing firm that worked across residential and commercial properties throughout Middle Tennessee. Marcus was a natural. He understood people in the intuitive, almost careless way that made him good at selling things, and he moved through the industry quickly. By the time he was 26, he had started his own firm. He called it Summit Property Partners, and it was small, but it was his, and the pride he carried about it was not a quiet thing. He called me on a Wednesday night when I was 22, finishing up an accounting degree at a community college and working part-time at a grocery co-op to cover my rent. Our mother had recently had a difficult stretch with her health, and our father had started talking about retirement in the tentative, slightly frightened way of a man who has worked hard his whole life and does not entirely know who he is without the work. "I have something for you," Marcus said, "something real. Come work for me." He made it sound like a gift. I should have looked at the wrapping more carefully before I opened it. The role Marcus described was Office and Operations Manager for Summit Property Partners, coordinating contractors, managing client schedules, maintaining project timelines, overseeing permit filings, and keeping the administrative side of the business running smoothly while he focused on acquiring new properties and building relationships. It was real work, he said, important work, and he would pay me a fair wage plus cover a portion of my housing costs through a lease arrangement on a unit his company managed in East Nashville. I said yes within 24 hours. I have thought about that decision more times than I can count, and what I understand now is that I said yes not because the offer was exceptional, but because Marcus said it, and I still believed, at 22, that he was the axis the world rotated around. Old habit, old love, old blindness, wearing the face of trust. The salary was real, but it was low. I discovered that about 4 months in when I started doing some research and found that the same role at comparable firms was paying between 30 and 40% more than what I was receiving. The housing arrangement was convenient, not generous, and the job itself expanded almost immediately beyond anything he had described, not through one dramatic moment, but through the slow accumulation of small additions, each reasonable on its own, each presented as temporary, each becoming permanent without announcement. Within 8 months, I was managing his personal travel alongside the business calendar. I was drafting correspondence he signed his name to. I was coordinating the renovation of his own apartment on my lunch breaks because his contractor kept calling and Marcus did not want to deal with it himself. I was on my phone at 7 in the morning and sometimes past 10 at night, responding to things that could have waited but that Marcus flagged as urgent, because urgency was the water he moved through, and he expected everyone around him to swim at the same pace without the same oxygen. When I brought up the discrepancy between what I was doing and what I was being paid, he had a way of addressing it that left me feeling like I had raised something small and slightly embarrassing. He would acknowledge it, just barely, and then immediately reframe the conversation around vision. "Serena, we are in a growth phase," he would say. "When this next deal closes, everything changes. When we get through Q3, I am going to restructure compensation across the board. You are not just an employee here. You are the person I trust most with all of this. The person he trusted most." I kept that phrase like a stone in my pocket, smooth from handling, the kind you reach for without thinking. And for 2 years it was enough to keep me from asking the question I should have been asking all along, which was, if you trust me most, why do I keep getting the least? The answer to that question arrived eventually through a woman named Daphne Okafor. Daphne was a paralegal at a property law firm that Summit used intermittently for contract review, and she and I developed an easy, comfortable friendship over shared coffee during a long closings process that stretched across 3 weeks. She was sharp and observant in the particular way of people who spend their professional lives reading documents carefully, and she had the rare quality of being honest without being unkind. One afternoon, near the end of that closing process, she looked across the table at me after I had just fielded my 4th call from Marcus in 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the contract in front of us, and she said something that I have carried ever since. "Serena," she said, "does he actually know what you do every day, or does he just know that it gets done?" I laughed. The way you laugh when something lands and you are not ready to let it fully land yet. But I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about it at my desk the next morning. I thought about it for the better part of a week while I kept showing up and doing everything that needed doing and staying late and answering calls and covering gaps and filing things and coordinating things and arranging things, all of it flowing through me the way water flows through infrastructure, invisible, essential, never credited. What I eventually understood was that Marcus did not see what I did because he had arranged his perception of the office so that my labor was ambient. It was background, it was weather, it happened the way rooms stayed clean and inboxes stayed organized and schedules stayed on time and problems resolved themselves before he ever had to engage with them. He had not built a business, he had built a system in which I was the working mechanism and he was the face at the front. Daphne helped me begin to document it. Not with any specific plan in mind at first, just with the quiet precision of someone who finally wants to understand the shape of what she has been living inside. She walked me through how to log hours, how to categorize duties, how to compare market data to what I was currently earning. She was patient and she was thorough, and she did not once try to tell me what to do with the information. She just helped me see it clearly. What I saw was not comfortable. 3 years of service that had been consistently undervalued in compensation, a role that had grown far beyond its original scope without any adjustment to reflect that growth. Verbal assurances about equity and restructuring that had been made repeatedly and fulfilled never. and a brother who had somehow convinced me, through repetition and familiarity and the weight of shared history, that this arrangement was not exploitation but investment. I had been investing in Summit Property Partners for 3 years. I had received almost nothing in return except the ongoing privilege of being indispensable to a man who did not notice how indispensable I was because I had made it look too easy. That was the month Marcus purchased the land. He called to tell me about it with the energy of someone who has just made the best decision of his life and wants an audience for the moment. 40 acres in a rural pocket of Maury County, Tennessee, about an hour southwest of Nashville. He was going to build a home. Not a house, he said, a home. Something permanent, something that said he had arrived. He described it with the specificity of someone who had been mentally inhabiting the space for months already. A main house with a guest wing, a workshop, room for a garden, a fire pit, a proper driveway lined with trees. He was already in conversation with an architect. I listened, and I said the appropriate things, and when the call ended, I sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows the realization that something has shifted. It was Daphne who connected the pieces. She had been helping me think through what a responsible exit from Summit might look like, not because she pushed me toward leaving, but because she had seen enough of the situation by then to understand that I was making decisions from a position of incomplete information, and she wanted me to have the full picture before I made any decision at all. She pulled the property survey on Marcus's new land out of professional habit, the same way she pulled documents on everything she touched. She called me the following evening with the steady, unhurried voice of someone who has found something significant and wants to make sure it is communicated without distortion. "There is something here you need to understand before he breaks ground," she said. She walked me through the survey over the phone, slowly and precisely. Marcus's 40 acres sat at the interior of a rural parcel arrangement that left his land with only one physical connection to the public road network, a single private access lane, unpaved and just under half a mile long, crossing through a neighboring property before reaching the county road. Without legal access to that lane, his 40 acres were landlocked, inaccessible by any public route. That lane did not belong to Marcus. It ran across a parcel owned by an elderly man named Carlton Pruitt, a widower in his mid-80s who had lived in a care facility in Columbia for nearly 2 years. His only living relative was a great-nephew, a man named Wesley who had relocated to Oregon years earlier and had made it known to the county tax office that he was not interested in maintaining the land. The parcel was 2 years delinquent in property taxes. Carlton's estate, managed by a local attorney under a power of attorney arrangement, was looking for options. Daphne paused after she finished walking me through it. "I know what you are thinking," she said, "and I want you to think about it carefully before you do anything." I told her I would. I spent 10 days thinking about it. Not impulsively, not in anger, but with the methodical focus of someone who has finally decided to take themselves seriously. I thought about what I was owed. I thought about what leverage meant and what I was and was not willing to become in using it. I thought about my brother, the boy from Millbrook who used to bring me the first slice of watermelon every summer because he said the first piece was always the best piece and younger sisters should get the best things. Then I thought about 3 years of late nights and underpayment and promises that evaporated at the end of every quarter like morning fog, and I made my decision. Daphne connected me with a property acquisition attorney who understood the mechanics of tax-delinquent rural parcels in Tennessee. The pathway was clear and the timeline was real. The delinquency meant the county was preparing to act within months, and the great-nephew Wesley had already indicated through correspondence that a clean private sale was preferable to a tax auction. The purchase price, the back taxes, and the transaction costs together represented nearly everything I had saved over 3 years of living carefully. I signed the documents on a gray Thursday afternoon in February. I remember the weight of the pen and the particular quiet of that office and the way the deed looked once my name was on it. Serena Voss, owner of a half-mile access lane in Maury County, Tennessee. Daphne met me in the parking lot afterward. She did not say anything right away. She just looked at me for a moment, nodded once, and then said, "Now we finish the other part." The other part was the documentation I had been building for months, the compensation discrepancy, the scope of duties performed outside any reasonable interpretation of my role, the verbal commitments Marcus had made and never kept. Daphne helped me organize it into a clear and complete picture, not for litigation but for negotiation, because what I wanted was not a courtroom. What I wanted was an honest accounting between two people who had shared a childhood and had somewhere along the way forgotten what it meant to treat each other fairly. I sent Marcus a formal letter requesting a meeting to discuss my employment terms and the possibility of a structured departure. He replied in 3 days, which told me he sensed something had shifted even if he did not yet know what. He picked a coffee shop in the Gulch neighborhood of Nashville, which I understood as his way of making the conversation feel casual and contained. I arrived first. I chose a table near the back, away from the door, and I placed my folder on the table in front of me and ordered coffee and waited. Marcus came in wearing the particular expression he reserved for situations he had already decided he could handle. Relaxed, slightly elevated. The expression of a man who believes the room belongs to him. He sat down. He glanced at the folder. He ordered his coffee. Then he looked at me and said, "So what is this about?" I told him. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform emotion. I simply laid it out the way Daphne had helped me understand it, clearly and in sequence, with the documentation to support every claim. The market comparisons, the hours, the undocumented duties, the 3 years of assurances that had produced nothing. He listened. His expression moved through several versions of itself as I spoke. At first, dismissive, then recalibrating, then something that looked almost like recognition, which was the most uncomfortable thing to witness because it meant some part of him had always known. "Serena," he said when I finished, "I hear what you are saying, but you have to understand that everything I built, you were a part of building it. That counts for something. What it counts for is exactly what I have outlined in that document," I said. "That is not me diminishing what we built together. That is me asking for what the market says that building was worth." He leaned back. "Let me think about this. Let me look at the numbers." "I have 2 weeks," I said. "After that, I will be submitting my resignation regardless, and there is one additional thing you should know before this meeting ends." I placed the second document on the table. He picked it up. He read the first paragraph. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not calculation, something rawer than either of those things. "You bought the access lane," he said. "I did," I said. He set the document down carefully. "That is the only way into that land, Serena. I know what it is, Marcus." The table went quiet. The coffee shop kept moving around us. Someone laughed near the front. Music was playing. And my brother sat across from me with a document in his hands that had rearranged every assumption he had been carrying into that conversation. He said, "When did you do this?" "A few weeks ago," I told him, "while I was still figuring out whether you and I could have a straightforward conversation about what is owed between us. I have not decided yet whether we can." He had nothing to say to that. I let the quiet sit. He did not call for 4 days. When he did, the version of his voice on the line was different from any version I had heard before, quieter and more deliberate, the way a person speaks when they are choosing words carefully, because they finally understand the stakes. Marcus had consulted an attorney in the interim. The attorney had apparently confirmed what Daphne and I already knew, that the access lane acquisition was legal, properly recorded, and fully enforceable. There was no implied easement that would hold, no prescriptive right that applied cleanly, no fast legal path that bypassed me. The property he had purchased and the home he intended to build on it required access to a road I now owned. When Marcus called, he did not open with legal arguments or accusations. He said, "What do you need from me for this to be resolved fairly?" I told him, full back compensation calculated at accurate market rate for the full 3 years of my employment, a formal exit package reflecting the scope of what I had actually contributed to Summit, and a permanent recorded easement on the access lane, transferable with his property and independent of any ongoing relationship between us. He asked about the figure. I told him Daphne and I had calculated it together, and I was confident in the number. There was a long pause. "You prepared for this," he said. "I prepared for the possibility that we would not be able to work this out between us like adults," I said. "I am still hoping we can." The silence that followed was different from the one at the coffee shop. That one had been stunned. This one was thoughtful, almost respectful, like a man standing in front of a wall he had assumed was temporary and understanding for the first time that it had always been structural. We worked out the terms over the following 2 weeks through our respective attorneys. The financial settlement was real, and it was fair, and it represented something more than money. It represented 3 years of labor that had been quietly diminished, given back to me with an acknowledgement, however transactional, that it had existed and it had mattered. The easement was drafted to be permanent, transferable, and recorded against both parcels in perpetuity. I insisted on the same terms I would have wanted for myself: clear, documented, and not dependent on goodwill. Marcus came to see me about a month after everything was finalized. He did not call first. He just showed up at the apartment I had moved into, a place I had found entirely on my own in a part of the city I had chosen, because I liked the light through the kitchen window in the mornings. He knocked, and I opened the door, and we stood there for a moment looking at each other, without the buffer of any ongoing business between us. I let him in. We sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table, the way two people sit when they are not quite ready to be close but are not willing to stay away. He had brought 2 coffees from a place down the street, which was the same thing he used to do when we were teenagers, and he wanted to have a conversation that mattered. I noticed that, and I let it mean what it meant. He said, "I want you to know I did not think of myself as someone who was taking advantage of you." I said, "I know." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "I thought because you were good at everything that it was sustainable. I thought because you never pushed back harder that it was working for you too. There is a difference between not pushing back and being fine," I told him. "I was not pushing back because I did not want to lose you. That is not the same thing at all." He nodded and kept nodding for a moment after he should have stopped, the way people do when something has settled into a place they were not ready for it to settle. We talked for nearly 2 hours, about our parents who were aging in the slow, real way that changes the texture of everything, about Millbrook, which neither of us had visited in too long, about what Summit would look like going forward, and what I intended to do next, which was take a position I had already been offered at a development consultancy where the pay was fair and the work was credited, and no one expected me to make the invisible visible on their behalf. When he left, I did not watch him from the window. I washed the cups and stood at the sink for a minute looking out at the street, and what I felt was not the satisfaction of having won something, but the quieter, more durable feeling of having stopped losing. The months that followed were the first in recent memory that felt genuinely like mine. The consultancy was everything the previous 3 years had not been. My name was on the work. My contributions were acknowledged in the rooms where they mattered. Within the first year, I had become someone people sought out for her judgment, not just her capacity to execute someone else's vision. That distinction sounds small until you have spent years on the wrong side of it. I signed a lease on a studio space I was not yet entirely sure what to do with because I had started drawing again, something I had abandoned without noticing sometime in the middle of the Summit years, and I wanted a place to do it that was separate from the place where I slept. Small extravagances matter after a long period of not believing you deserve any. Daphne and I had dinner on the evening I received my first performance review at the consultancy, the kind of review that uses specific language and describes specific contributions and makes you feel like the person reading it actually knew what they were reading. She ordered a bottle of something worth drinking and raised her glass and said only, "There she is." 2 words. I did not need more than that. Marcus's home in Maury County was completed 14 months after the settlement. He sent me a photograph of the main house once the exterior was finished. No message attached, just the image. The driveway lined with young trees he had planted. The wide front porch. The workshop visible at the far edge of the frame. It looked like what he had always described wanting, and I looked at it for a long time before I put the phone down. The easement runs in both directions along that lane now, recorded in full and transferred with both properties the way a right-of-way should always have been established. He can come and go freely. That was never in question for me. What I wanted was not the power to block him. What I wanted was for him to understand that the power had always existed, that I had simply been too willing to pretend otherwise. The difference between those two things is not small. What I learned from all of this is something I think about more often than I expected to, not with bitterness but with a kind of careful clarity. There are people in our lives who take from us not out of malice, but out of the simple convenience of our willingness to give. They are not always calculating. Sometimes they are just comfortable, and our discomfort has never been loud enough to interrupt that comfort. The problem is not always their intention. The problem is the arrangement, and arrangements do not correct themselves. They have to be renegotiated, deliberately and with full knowledge of what you are asking for and why. The other thing I learned is that doing that, standing up inside a relationship that matters and saying this is not working the way it should, does not have to mean destroying what is between you. It can mean rebuilding it on terms that are honest. That is harder than walking away and considerably harder than staying silent, but it is the only version that has a real future in it. Marcus and I are not what we were before all of this. I do not think we will get back to exactly that, and I have stopped wanting to, because what we were before was built partly on my willingness to be less than I was, in order to make space for him to be more. What we are now is something smaller on the surface and more solid underneath. We talk on Sundays sometimes. He asks about the consultancy. I ask about the house. We are two people who share a history and are figuring out, slowly and without a map, what that means now that the old dynamic between us has been quietly retired. Last spring, he drove up to Nashville and we had lunch at a place near the river. It was the first time we had sat across from each other in a public setting since the coffee shop meeting where everything began to shift, and it was different. There was no folder on the table, no document waiting to be placed in front of someone, just two people with a long shared past trying to find out what the future version of their relationship was going to feel like. It felt awkward in places, honest in others, and toward the end of the meal, almost comfortable. I will take that. I will take awkward and honest over smooth and false on any given day of the week. He said something as we were leaving that I have thought about several times since. He said, "I did not realize how much I was counting on you to just keep going. Like you were a thing that ran on its own and did not need to be checked on or accounted for." He said it with a kind of bewildered shame that was, I think, as close to a full apology as he knows how to give. I told him I understood that, because I did. I had made myself so reliable, so seamless, so quietly indispensable, that I had effectively communicated to him that everything was fine. I had trained him to take me for granted by never once making it costly to do so. That is not an excuse for what he did, but it is a part of the truth that I have had to sit with as well. Accountability, when you are being honest about it, rarely belongs entirely to one person. It is not a perfect ending. But it is an honest one. And after years of mistaking silence for peace and availability for love, honesty is the thing I find I value most, not just in how others treat me, but in how I carry myself. In whether I say the true thing when the true thing is difficult. In whether I ask for what I am worth instead of waiting to be given it. That is the part of this story that does not make it onto a property deed. The internal shift. The slow reconstruction of a self that had been gradually handed over to someone else's priorities until there was barely enough left to recognize. Learning to take up the space you are entitled to without apology and without aggression. Learning that protecting yourself is not the same as hardening yourself. Learning that love, real love, does not require you to disappear. I have carried a lot of things for a lot of people in my life, and I expect I will continue to, because that is part of who I am, and I do not think I would want to change it entirely. What I have changed is the cost. What I have changed is the terms. What I have changed is my willingness to hand over my time, my labor, and my quiet competence to someone who does not understand the value of what they are receiving. Those things are not free. They never were. I will take an honest beginning over a comfortable arrangement every single time.